Hello again. Bernie Miklasz back with you here for another edition of The Bernie Show, brought to you by DraftKings. The crown is yours. And of course, you know me, I think, but for those of you who don't, I've been writing and talking about St. Louis sports since 1985, was a lead sports columnist at the Post-Dispatch, STL Today, for 26 years. Today, I'm very happy at my new home, STL Sports Central, where I do 5 videos and write 5 columns a week and jump on with Randy Carricker every Friday and do some other things that come up from time to time, and I love every minute of it. Also appear frequently on KMOX. I joined Katie Wu in the Cardinal Territory video podcast. For many years, I've done the weekly Seeing Red podcast with my friend Will Leach, which is quite popular, and you can find it wherever you get your podcast. All right, preliminaries aside, let's get to today's topic. And before I do, let me just say something here. I waited to do this particular video. I waited and waited because I thought that what went down, the team responsible for doing it would have realized the incredible error of their decision. And I said, well, I'm not going to do this video and I'm not going to rip anybody because clearly the people in charge of making this decision will reconsider and fix it, right? I really thought that. Well, it shows you how damn naive I am, right? And you think I should know better by now, right? So here is the topic after that little teaser. I am still shocked and saddened by what the Blues did to John Kelly, the TV voice for this franchise, and much, much more than that for the last 21 seasons. By declining to renew Kelly's contract, the Blues fired him, and they can explain it or they could put any kind of labeling on it that they want, but they basically sacked John Kelly, and that is inexcusable, and it is certainly something that, I'll be honest, man, I never thought a team led by Tom Stillman, I never thought they would do something like this. Once again, silly me. When will I learn? Listen, I'm not into corporate speak, so let's call it for what this is. Cost cutting, being cheap, a warm-hearted franchise, supposedly, now going cold-hearted and putting their desire to save money ahead of their loyalty to John Kelly. And a failure to appreciate all that JK has done for the Blues franchise, the Blues brand, and for the vast and thriving St. Louis hockey community. Not only that, it was a slap in the face to the many Blues fans of multiple generations who have treasured not only John Kelly, but the Kelly name as it pertains to Blues hockey. It was a remarkably ruthless act of unplugging an immense part of this franchise tradition, having a Kelly calling the games. Since the Blues' inception in 1967, I was trying to count it up to be exact, and I don't think I'm going to be exact, but I'm going to be close enough. Kelly has been at the mic handling the play-by-play for Blues hockey for a combined total of about 45 years, and it might even be a little more than that. The Blues have been in existence for 58 years, and that also includes the year that there was no hockey because of the labor war, right? But they've been in existence for 58 years. And in the 57 years, at least, where there were games to call, Kelly has been a huge part of the soundtrack for all of those hockey falls, those hockey winners, and those springtimes of playoff hockey in St. Louis. Based on my unofficial calculations, Kelly was doing the broadcast for it. This includes radio and TV. Kelly was doing the broadcast for about 75% of the time that the Blues have been on the ice competing since they became the Blues. Now, where do you find that in professional sports? Seriously, where do you find that? I don't think you find it anywhere in North America, where one family has been behind the mic for about 75% of the games that the teams played. I mean, this is a unique, incredibly unique, and I would even say we'll never see anything like this again. I'm certainly not in hockey. The iconic Dan Kelly, who needs no introduction, of course, was he's on the short list of the greatest play-by-play announcers in NHL history. He goes right up there with Foster Hewitt and some others we can mention. And the Blues and their fans were blessed to have Dan Kelly as their voice for 21 years. Dan Kelly's colorful, one of a kind, straight from the hip personality, very blunt, very funny, and that exceptional Hall of Fame skill at describing the play on the ice. It was a rare combination. You don't find it. Listen, in growing St. Louis hockey, in St. Louis, Dan Kelly was just as important as any star player who wore the blue note, and I don't believe that I am exaggerating that whatsoever. I grew up in Maryland, as some of you know, and as a teenage hockey fan, I would listen to Dan Kelly call blues games through the power of KMOX booming signal. And I would even shift places in my parents' home, or I would actually go sit in the driveway, whatever, so I could get, if it's one of those nights where the signal wasn't coming in, it wasn't as consistent, to where if I had the time and I wasn't working or whatever, I would do whatever I could to scramble to find that KMOX signal. Long before the internet, kids. Anyway, that stuff like that, and that's one story of a kid growing up in Maryland. There was just nothing like him. And that and much, much more is why there is a banner honoring Dan Kelly forever in the rafters of Enterprise Center. Listen, if Dan Kelly inspired me, a kid near Baltimore, which he did, I can't even comprehend how much he meant to hockey fans, young and old, here in St. Louis. And I remember meeting Dan Kelly for the first time, and I didn't know what to say. I mean, I was in such awe of the man. And so along comes John Kelly. And, you know, it's not easy. I don't think it's easy when your father is like one of the greatest of all time and you're in effect following in his career path. And it can't be easy. I know Joe Buck, like when he, became a Cardinals broadcaster, then Major League Baseball, at first everybody resented him because, well, his father's Jack Buck. He gave him the job. This is nepotism and all that stuff. And as I always said about that, it's one thing to get a job because of connections. You won't keep the job if you stink. You won't keep the job if you're not up to the standards. So yeah, you may catch a break, but in the end, you got to be damn good or great at what you're doing to keep the job. And, that brings us back to John Kelly. For more than 2 decades, John Kelly excelled in many areas, but let's go with 3 or 4 in particular. Number one, he was terrific at calling games. He developed his own style. He used a little bit of his father, the shoots and scores and all that, sure, as he should, right? He was terrific at calling games, developing signature expressions, at calibrating his emotions to perfection in that immediate reaction to a big moment for the Blues on the ice. He was not an actor. He is not an actor. JK's emotions, his passion, 100% authentic. He bled blue. Absolutely. Number 2, John Kelly was a tireless ambassador for the Blues in the community. I've talked to so many people about this. He never said no unless it was something he absolutely could not do for whatever reason. But he never said no if it was something that he could do. Anytime someone asked him for help in a charitable cause, to make an appearance, whatever it may be, you would see him at the arenas. He would be kind to fans. He would have a conversation. He'd make the kids smile. Everywhere he went, John Kelly, who is not, it's interesting. And John, I don't know that, I doubt that John watches, and I don't want him to take this the wrong way. But John actually is kind of a low-key guy. He's not the life of the party, so to speak. He's not this boisterous guy that's out there like, hello, shaking hands like politicians or whatever. He's a reserved guy. But John Kelly has always, that bright light in him has always shined through whenever he was around Blues fans. It lit him up in the best possible way. And it just shows you, that the Blues fans had this way of just sort of bringing him out of that kind of shell that he had. And that's such an obvious compliment to John Kelly and the fans. They brought out the best in each other. And he was a tireless ambassador for the Blues brand in the community. He was so kind to fans, as I mentioned. This wasn't just a job for John Kelly. This was his calling, and the Blues were his family, just as the Blues were his father, Dan Kelly's family. Third, John Kelly absolutely did his late father proud. You know that. Somewhere upstairs in that hockey booth on sacred ground, that Dan Kelly's smiling when he followed his son's career once his son came back to the Blues and started doing their games. And as I mentioned earlier, man, these things don't always go so well when a son follows the path of a distinguished father in the same profession. But we've been really fortunate to have Jack Buck and Joe Buck, just as, we are fortunate to have the memories and the experiences of Dan Kelly and John Kelly. John Kelly extended the family legacy and the Kelly hockey name in St. Louis. And by the way, I don't want to forget to mention Dan P. Kelly, who was John's half-brother's, Dan's son, who did Blues games on KMOX for 3 seasons in the late 90s. And I liked Dan a lot. I haven't stayed in touch with him, liked him a lot. He didn't have an easy job. He really did not have an easy job because he was a really young broadcaster who had to carry this cherished, almost sacred family name in St. Louis into the KMOX booth. And, that's just going to be a tough assignment based on the circumstances and Dan's age at the time, right? But John Kelly, well, we'll talk about this in a minute. We'll get back to this in a minute in terms of John Kelly's career path. But over time, in something that wasn't guaranteed to work, wasn't guaranteed to be a success, John Kelly, in fact, grew into the job, or he was already grown into the job, but he took the job and made it his. He became an institution in St. Louis in his own right in terms of sports media, hockey media. And it wasn't just because of his famous father. The love and respect for John Kelly among fans with the St. Louis Blues was truly earned. Fans loved him for who he was. John created his own identity, and that he always embraced his father's identity and his father's legacy, but John managed to be his own man and create his own style and his own identity. I really admire that. He didn't have to ride his father's fame. He had his father's name, but John Kelly became his own name and his own man, revered for his comforting presence in presenting Blues games, revered for being part of the overall Blues family for all those years. John Kelly was Dan Kelly's son, but during his time with the Blues, John Kelly became just as much of a part of the Blues family as his father had become such a huge part of the Blues family. Another thing, and this is what I was going to talk about, I've always admired about John Kelly, was his determination to establish credibility by working in other hockey markets like Tampa Bay and Colorado. He did briefly, for a couple years, I believe, have the Blues job doing the TV games, but there was something about it that was off-putting at the time. And when he got an offer from Tampa Bay, he took it. And it wasn't because he didn't want to be in St. Louis. It wasn't because he didn't want to do Blues games. I could be wrong about this, but I think at least part of this was based on John's ambition to be as good as he could be before he stepped into a long-term broadcasting career with the Blues. That was his way of honoring his father, right? So he left the Blues after a brief time. He went to Tampa Bay, then Colorado. He's a play-by-play man for one of their first Stanley Cup champion. Nepotism was not part of his resume. John Kelly developed his talent and earned his respect outside of St. Louis as well, independent of his father's name and legacy and the connection with the Blues. John Kelly earned it in other markets, and yeah, they knew who Dan Kelly was. They respected Dan Kelly and all that. But if they didn't like John Kelly, they weren't going to like John Kelly. If they didn't think he was good, they weren't going to think he was good just because he was Dan Kelly's son. I just admire the career track that John Kelly took. And all of this makes the Blues decision even more indefensible. To have Dan Kelly and then John Kelly doing your games long before the Blues won a Stanley Cup added prestige and prominence to the franchise. With the Kellys, The broadcasters often were, the Kelly broadcasters often were more acclaimed than the team itself. And, I don't have to tell long-term Blues fans, the Blues have experienced all kinds of instability along the way, all kinds of failure and heartbreak and chaos at the ownership level, everything else. But they always had Dan Kelly, and then they had John Kelly representing them and doing their games. And with them, with the Kellys as such a, I can't say a permanent part of the landscape, but a very important and long-term part of the Blues hockey landscape. It was a touch of class. It was a touch of class for the Blues that elevated that franchise above the financial challenges and difficulties, all of the shenanigans at the ownership level, the failure to win a Stanley Cup, all of those playoff postseason flameouts when they had great teams and they won the Stanley Cup finally, their 51st season on the ice. And with the Kelly upstairs describing the action, no matter if the Blues were bad, if they were mediocre, if they were good, if they were great. One of the reasons they always had a respected brand, no matter what, was because Dan Kelly and then later on John Kelly. And again, as a guy growing up on the East Coast, I developed a real fondness for the Blues. And Dan Kelly was a huge reason why. That's what I'm talking about. And the Blues back in those days were not very good. I didn't care. I loved the Blue Note. Two reasons: Dan Kelly and the Blue Note emblem, right? So I'm bringing that up not to talk about myself, but it's a way for me to point out how they transcended. They were able to transcend all those times that they were a non-factor, they mediocre, they were bad or what on the ice. Boy, they had Dan Kelly. And that tells you something about the Blues. If you can have Dan Kelly doing your game all those years. And I think that there's only going to be one Dan Kelly, but I think John Kelly would be the first to tell you, he wasn't going to be able to replicate that. He wasn't going to build a national audience of like people like me, the kid outside of Baltimore, who was going to listen to Blues games just because of Dan Kelly, because Dan Kelly is, one of the all-time icons. But John Kelly built an audience for the Blues in St. Louis. He did it from his perch as a broadcaster, and he did it off the ice. John Kelly became synonymous with the Blues franchise, and he extended the Kelly name in a way that made that long-term historical bond as powerful as ever. And that brand, that Blues brand, no matter what was on the ice, that Kelly name always resonated. And it's a rare thing to have in professional sports where you get great publicity and goodwill because a father and then a son with the last name Kelly were viewed with so much respect in North America, right? And that's why another reason, this is so hard to find this kind of thing. And this is another reason why I'm shocked by this. What was Chairman Tom Stillman thinking? What was CEO of Business Operations Chris Zimmerman doing? This was a remarkably tone-deaf decision, and the reasons behind it were not only frustrating, they really, really made me and many of you mad. You don't mess with family because of financial motivations. You don't betray family because you're worried about making your broadcast partner happy. That's shameful conduct. I'm sorry. And I know it's a tough world out there. I'm going to get into that in my next segment, my final segment of the day of the Bernie Show on this July the 15th. But first, I'm pleased to talk about DraftKings and their daily Pick 6 fantasy game. With the annual MLB All-Star Game on tap for Tuesday night, here's your chance of getting the game. At least try it out by giving DraftKings a try if you haven't done it already. If you think you know baseball, well, put that sharp mind to work and take a shot at winning big cash prizes through the daily Pick 6 fantasy contest at DraftKings. In DraftKings Pick 6, you just focus on player stats, all kinds of different sports, by the way. You just focus on player stats. You select anywhere from 2 to 6 players for your lineup, and you choose whether the individual player will go higher or lower that on the specific stat line set for him in the next game by DraftKings. It's that simple. It's a lot of fun. So get in the game. Take your chance, your best shot at winning the money. I always like to offer an example or two about how DraftKings Pick Six works. So here's an example for the All-Star game tonight. DraftKings has set a line of 0.5 home runs for a lot of hitters. In fact, all the hitters for the most part. But I'm focusing on one guy, Braves outfielder Ronald Acuna Jr. He's playing in his home ballpark. He's got a lot of natural flair. He loves big moments. He's got immense talent. And he's going to be trying to do something dramatic tonight in Atlanta. So if you think Acuna will pop an early home run, I mean, I can't say how many innings he'll play, but he should probably get a couple of ABs. If you think he'll pop an early home run, then you select higher than 0.5. If you don't think so, because maybe he won't get more than a bat or two, you don't think he's going to go deep, then you go with the lower choice. That applies to just a lot of the players in this game tonight. That line of 0.5 homers applies to Aaron Judge and Ohtani and Cal Riley and Manny Machado, Kyle Tucker, Will Smith, Francisco Lindor, Freddie Freeman, Junior Caminara, Vlad Guerrero Jr., Kyle Tucker, if I didn't mention him already, Pete Crow Armstrong, on and on and on and on. So you can pick through that list. If you go to the app, you download the app, you click on the profile of the player, and you'll get some clues, or you get some helpful information about making your decision. All right, Pick Six is available in most states, including Missouri, California, Texas, Georgia, and more. Very easy to get going. Download that excellent DraftKings app and open an account, then choose a sport, pick your players, and go for it. New players at DraftKings get $50 in Pick Six credits instantly with just a $5 entry. Download the DraftKings Pick Six app now and use the code STL Sports. That's code STL Sports for new customers to play $5 and get $50 in Pick Six credits. Better payouts, bigger wins. Only with Pick Six from DraftKings, the crown is yours.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 and over. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick Six not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. One per new customer. Bonus awarded as non-withdrawable Pick Six credits that expire in 14 days. Limited time offer. See terms at picksix.draftkings.com/promos.
All right, thank you for waiting for me to get back. This is part two about the Blues' terrible decision to basically put John Kelly out on the curb at Clark and 14th, metaphorically speaking, of course. So, listen, Blues fans know this already. The Blues are shifting to a simulcast model, and they'll have the same broadcast on TV and radio, handled by the team of Chris Kerber and Joey Vitale. Listen, I wish him well. None of my criticisms here are directed at Kerbs and Joey. And it is also true that more and more NHL teams are shifting to the simulcast model. Okay, I get it. But just because the other teams are doing it, it doesn't mean that the Blues should do it. One thing I've learned in my 45 years in this business, be extremely skeptical when a team tells you that a decision wasn't made because of money. And here's what I know to be sure about 98% of the time. When a sports franchise does something controversial and there's a backlash, and if it has anything to do with a contract or anything like that, as soon as they tell you this, well, it's not about the money. They are confirming and reaffirming that it was all about the money. And they're like, frankly, they're not smart enough to realize that, because as soon as you say, well, no, this had nothing to do with the money, you're basically saying, yeah, it had everything to do with the money. What do you want me to do about it? But they won't, they can't do it. And in this case, there can be no other reason, because let me ask you this. If it wasn't about the money, all about the money, what would the Blues gain by abandoning John Kelly and disrespecting him and his father's memory? There'd be no motivation to do that. This was all about the money. So when Chris Zimmerman made it worse when he told reporters, and this was from a Jeremy Rutherford story in The Athletic, and I quote, this is Zimmerman, quote, "I definitely wouldn't characterize it as a cost-cutting move." Come on, Chris, come on, man. You're smarter than this. Well, he went on to do a round and round, little tap dance about, well, the changes in the sports business, yada, 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 yada. Then he returned to a place that was closer to the truth. Zimmerman said, and I quote, "Are there some costs saved by not having two separate productions?" Sure, he said. And then he went on more, which is like Ring Around the Rosie, let's tap dance around everything. A lot of head fakes and deeks and everything else. Oh, the scope of our business, yada, 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 yada. He said, Zimmerman, and I quote one more time, "This move wouldn't be happening unless it was part of a commitment to believe that we can be better. Our goal is to have the best broadcast in the league." All right. I wish I had a whistle because that's a game misconduct right there with that quote. You abandoned the extremely popular and beloved John Kelly, a future hockey media Hall of Famer, and you turned your back on all that he did for this franchise, and you're saying it's because you wanted to have a better broadcast? You talk about kicking a guy out and then kicking him again when he was down by trying to frame this as an attempt to have a better broadcast. This is insulting not only to John Kelly, but it should be insulting to a good majority of Blues fans. John Kelly wasn't fading out in job performance. He wasn't getting lost calling a game. He was still, he's 65. He's a young 65. He was still alert and peak form as a broadcaster. And he still had the kind of value to the franchise that cannot be calculated by some suits at a failing company, Diamond Sports, who wanted to cut costs after emerging from bankruptcy. Listen, I know I'm not naive in this regard. I know it's a difficult situation for teams in the NHL, Major League Baseball, and the NBA who have been damaged by Diamond Sports Group's shaky financial model and their poor business model and their ensuing bankruptcy proceedings. Some teams were cut loose altogether. And Diamond Sports did retain other teams like the Cardinals and the Blues, but for lower rights fees. They weren't going to give those teams as much money. So, yeah, I get it. There are a lot of beasts in this particular jungle. There's a lot of predators. So it isn't as easy as it used to be to maneuver and be able to keep the people you want, also have a great broadcast, and please the people that own your broadcast rights. And that's why Zimmerman, one more quote, I apologize, he made sure to remind everyone, quote, "Our broadcasters have always been employees of the regional network. This decision is a joint decision." Okay, here we go. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty, the truth. "This doesn't justify the cold-blooded, greed-based whacking of John Kelly. Any short-term financial gain is nothing compared to the damage the Blues have done to their reputation here," okay? A few weeks ago, I did a video here. You may remember it. It's there if you want to see it. Because I'm like, gosh, man, the Blues are so impressive in every way. And I did a lot of it about Doug Armstrong's summer moves and things like that. But talked about Tom Stillman, that whole operation, how they run their franchise with class, how they maintain their deep connection with their fans, how I had always thought highly of Tom Stillman and his leadership and how great it's been for the franchise. And at the time, I absolutely did that video. I absolutely believed what I said, which was the Blues have set the standard for pro sports in St. Louis. Well, I wish I would have caught wind of about what they were about to do. Now this. So the thing that really bothers me, and I'm going to explain it to you this way now, and it's quick. The thing that makes me shake my head about all of this before you decide that John Kelly is disposable, right? By agreeing with Diamond Sports Group and essentially co-signing on the decision to save money by telling Kelly to go away, and that's exactly what the Blues did. They capitulated to Diamond Sports Group by co-signing on this decision to save money and keep Diamond Sports Group happy by telling John Kelly to scram so they can go to a simulcast. The Blues followed the lead. The Blues followed the lead of a poorly operated company that ran up $9 billion, as in B, $9 billion in debt and had to file for bankruptcy in 2023 because they overpaid for rights to all these sports leagues. They didn't have this. They didn't have the advanced vision of realizing that, the cable industry in terms of, cord cutting and all that was taking a dramatic turn. So they were left holding the bag because they couldn't look into the future. They ran up $9 billion in debt and they had to go to bankruptcy, and they came out of it with their debt greatly reduced. But by doing that, they also did damage to the franchise that they had relationships with. And they told some of them to go away, like the San Diego Padres as an example. But this is who you're listening to. This is when they say, well, we want to do this. Oh, so you're going to say, well, yeah, after all, the Diamond Sports Group is a incredibly successful sports media empire. We ought to listen to them because these people know all about this. They're great at what they do. So we better go along with it. I mean, it's preposterous, right? The Blues went from a cherished partnership with John Kelly that meant absolutely nothing as soon as they capitulated to their business partner that did not see John Kelly as anything of value beyond the money that they could save by slashing his salary from the books. That's it. And when the Blues shamefully, disgracefully went along with this, they not only wronged John Kelly, but they dishonored the memory of his late father. You think I'm being dramatic? I'm not doing it for effect. That's exactly how I feel. The Blues elected to break a hallowed, historically beautiful bond that transcended the business of sport. Dan Kelly, then John Kelly, they were assets. They were family. John Kelly was special to the team's fans, just like his father was. And as soon as they got a little pressure from a company that not long ago worked itself into $9 billion worth of debt, all of a sudden, John Kelly was treated by the Blues like a disposable item. All of that history, that great relationship for decades, what he meant to the fans, what his father meant to the fans, this whole great experience, all of that history just thrown out like that. Listen, I mentioned this at the beginning. The backlash from Blues fans has been so extreme and unrelenting. I actually thought the level of their angst and their anger would cause the Blues to change their minds and just have a meeting and say, you know what, look, this is embarrassing. What were we thinking? We never should have done this. Let's get this. Let's mend this. Let's get John Kelly back to our family. That's where he belongs. But no, and it just shows that Stillman really underestimates what John Kelly meant to the fan base. And it's okay if you make a mistake, because we all do, as long as you work hard to fix it. And then you can be forgiven as long as you try to fix it and make it better and correct the wrong, right? And I really thought that maybe they would just change their mind when they saw the depth of the anger and disappointment and heartbreak. And this move, I thought, was so out of character for Stillman. I thought that was a reason why he would just say, look, we got to do this over again. We got to have John Kelly. And now I realize I should have known better. This is just another reminder, sadly, just another reminder of how the business of professional sports in this day and age can harden your soul, right? Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave your comments. And thanks to DraftKings for presenting The Bernie Show. The crown is yours. Thank you very much.